I don't trip as I'm coming up here on the stage. My name is Grzywacz, and I'm on the faculty at Florida State University. One of the things that's been capturing the attention and the minds of a lot of people these days is scientific reproducibility and replicability. The downside is that it's been around for an awful long time. The foundation of science is that we should be able to reproduce the findings with the hope of then being able to move things forward and make the world essentially a better place. The downside, though, is over the course of the last few years, you may have seen some things in the New Yorker, you may have seen some things in some of your professional organizations. No more than 11% of the treatments for cancer have been able to be reproduced. If we take a look a little bit closer to home, if we take a close look at the psychology literature, only about 39% of the studies that have been published in major psychological journals have been able to be reproduced. And when they are able to be reproduced, the effect size is only about 50% of what's been demonstrated in the original studies. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what an effect size is, think of this, a clinical trial being done to be able to take pain away after a surgery. The effect size might be complete relief from pain, but on replicability, only half of that pain is being taken away. Now, I'm not here to pick on science, because as a scientist myself, I completely understand the point that the only thing that we can know is where are we right now, right in this place, at this stage in time. Knowledge is constantly unfolding, right? It isn't this end point that we can keep striving for, but rather it's something that is ongoing. It takes time. But science is not a god. But unfortunately, we treat science as though if it is, as if it were. Consider, for example, a mother who adopted a young girl. This young girl has fetal alcohol syndrome. Like most other parents, at one point or another, she just gets exasperated. You know, the stress of the day, and this child isn't listening. There's no impulse control in any way, shape, or form. And in the heat of the moment, she grabs a shoulder. As the child is running away, the child falls and hits her head. Science says that when an investigation takes place by Child Protective Services, they need to go through all these different boxes. But what happens if only 50% or those 39% of the scientific findings actually hold for that particular criteria? That family has the opportunity of being pulled apart by the very science that was originally intended to benefit it in some way, shape, or form. Or what about the science that says, you know what, the best thing to do is to see to it that we put individuals in a classroom that speak the same language as the individuals who are receiving that information. It's best if the language is the same. If we have a bilingual teacher teaching a bilingual or Spanish-speaking only student. But what happens if that student doesn't have cultural competence? Or what happens if that teacher isn't competent in the culture that they're trying to speak to? So science is a complicated thing, and the things that we're trying to take on in families are equally complicated that unfold over time. Now, I'm not here to shoot at science and say, what do we know and what do we not know? Because again, I understand that it evolves. But one of the problems that we have in science is that if we can't reproduce, what foundation do we actually have to stand upon? And so I think the answer to that question, and one of the things that I would encourage you to think about, especially those of you in the audience who are researchers, who are educators, what I would encourage you to think about is, where does science fit in the ways that we know about human phenomena? Clearly, science can help us understand the way a parent and a child interacts with one another. It can help us understand that. But is it the only way of knowing? I would suggest to you that it's not. Even as we're thinking about ways of doing science, it's also important to recognize that that science needs to be informed by the very individuals for whom we're trying to benefit in some way, shape, or form. In a previous world, in a previous time, we like to think of science in terms as though it's this objective thing that emerges out of, theoretical knowledge, and then we can apply it in a universal fashion to just about anybody. But today we're starting to recognize, even though we embrace the notion of family diversity, We assume as though every family is essentially the same. A mom, a dad, biological child 1, biological child number 2. I'm not sure how we get to the point 4, but we'll figure that out in another time. But family diversity takes a lot of different forms. And so how are we going to help that family that says, okay, what are we going to do about this child that's been adopted and they've inherited all this stuff from early adoption? How are we going to help them to see to it that they survive as a family and that they are in fact treating, or that in fact the child is well equipped to do the things that they need to in order to be able to develop to their full potential? I'm going to submit that there's 3 or 4 ideas that I'd have you take away from this. Idea number 1 is let's talk to those families. Why does science have to be this objective thing that we can't reproduce anyway? Why not start with where the families are at? Because every family has a different story, a different starting point, a different set of baggage, if you want to refer to it, a different set of skills, a different set of attributes that they bring to getting together, to getting along as a marital unit, as getting along as a parent-child unit. So each one comes with a different package. So why not ask them about that? Number 2, why not ask the question about whether or not the things that we're actually even studying are the things that families would find useful. All too often, we're eager to try to make the world a better place, but we try to make it a better place based on what we know and what we value. But increasingly, at least according to the American Education Annual Journal, is that about 50% of our kids coming into schools right now are going to be coming in from impoverished backgrounds. So that means they're coming into school maybe not quite as ready to learn as some other folks. Maybe they're coming in with a few scars that maybe you or I didn't have when we came into school. So how well equipped is that research to actually inform the way we do practice in those classrooms? By contrast, those families might be a little bit more inclined to say, you know what I could really use some help with is helping me figure out a way that I can even out the blips and the blurps in between when one check comes in or when another check comes in. I don't necessarily need help communicating with my child. I think we're doing a pretty good job given the circumstances, but I could use some help being able to connect with them. So why not ask families what it is that they need? The third thing that I'd have you take away from this particular conversation or from this dialogue here tonight is what are the values that are implied in the very questions that we ask. I can tell you in the case of that one particular mother who Child Protective Services stepped in, her entire parenting approach came to a fundamental close, a fundamental stop. And the very system that was intended to help created difficulties because all of a sudden mom was second-guessing. What can she do? What are some alternative ways of disciplining when a child with fetal alcohol syndrome doesn't respond to a star chart or a sticker chart like normal children do? And so she found herself questioning herself, unable to make decisions about how to respond to behavior that was challenging, not only challenging and potentially threatening to the child, but then also to her siblings. We need research questions that ask those kinds of questions, or research studies that take on those kinds of questions. And so we need to be able to provide families with the things that they need. One of the things that I think is most important is I took a group of students out into the field one day, and we were going to collect data from households at a local public housing authority. We spent the entire day fielding surveys with poor families. All sorts of individuals, some known to be intoxicated. You could smell it on their breath. But at the end of the day, I said, so what was the number one thing that you learned here today? The most common answer from those 8 students who went out, 6 of which said, I never would have expected poor people to be that happy. So we've created the impression that poor individuals are not happy, they can't possibly be happy, and the people that we're actually training to take them out in the field to actually be able to help them have this misrepresentation of what it may mean to be poor. And so as we think about the questions that are relevant to that poor family, I would suggest to you that maybe we're approaching it from what we like, or the things that we would like to know, or from the things that we think that they should behave. But perhaps that's not what's in their best interest. We are now on the eve, or shortly after the eve, of 50 years of celebrating the war on poverty. Now, I'm not going to get into this debate, and maybe the subsequent speakers will be able to do a better job, because some people will argue that we haven't done a good job at all. We haven't budged the official poverty statistics over the course of the last 50 years. Other people will say, well, we have budged it. If you were going to put it into a medical context, you might say, you know what, we've changed it from a life-threatening condition to a chronic condition. It's no longer as debilitating as it once was, because now we have things like food stamps, and now we have things like Medicaid that allows individuals to get health care. But it's still poverty nonetheless. Impoverished children are still much less likely to complete high school, as was always the case. Impoverished children are still more likely to be African American or people of color, as has always been the case. Problems like behaviors, drug use, other forms of delinquency, still disproportionately more likely to happen in impoverished people. And what I'll suggest to you, that part of the reason for that is it takes on average about 17 years to go from scientific finding to implementation in evidence-based practice. The very phenomenon that we're trying to address has likely changed. Yes, poverty is the same, right? Poverty is staying equal all the way through. But the manifestation of poverty is going to look different 5 years ago, 5 years from now, and 15 years ago. So why would we expect that the phenomenon is going to stay stable? So it's important for us to be able to hear from the families. What is it that they want? What is it that they need, rather than the way that we think that they should behave? The last thing that I'd ask you to bear in mind as we bring this to a close is to be able to say, how and in what way are we using science to strengthen families? And is science the God that we've been expecting or setting it up to be? If we can only reproduce less than a third or approximately a third of the scientific findings, how do we know what we can actually stand on? So if we're looking at science for evidence-based practices, some of you are practitioners. And you say, I need to find that journal article, or I need to go to the repository of of evidence-based practices and procedures. You go there, you pull off your thing. How do you actually decide whether or not it's worth pursuing? Science is important. It's going to give you part of the answer. But part of it is also being able to say, will this be received in the community? Even with the best implementation, if it's not received by the community, how is it actually going to have an effect in some way, shape, or form? Not only that, not as far as how is it going to be received in the community, but also, is it relevant today? I do a fair amount of work with the immigrant Latino population. And you would think that despite the fact that in the not-so-distant future, Latinos are going to be the single largest ethnic group in the population, you'd be surprised at the absence of research among immigrant Latinos from Mexico, from rural Mexico. Guess where the vast majority of our young people who are coming into school right now and making their way through the school system, guess where they're from? They're coming from rural Mexico, or they're born to individuals from rural Mexico, and then they are U.S. citizens. But if you were going to try to take a cursory glance through the National Repository for Evidence-Based Medicine and Best Practice, what you'd find is maybe one or two of those programs has been developed for specifically for individuals from Mexico. But they're all the same. They're all the same. But wait a minute. Immigrants from Mexico are not the same as Puerto Ricans. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. Immigrants from Mexico are not the same as Cubans. They're refugees. That gives opportunities for asylum. That gives opportunities for special funding. That gives them opportunities where they don't necessarily have to hide in the shadows. And I'm not here to argue the case for the immigrant Latino family, but rather I use it to just simply illustrate the point that if our evidence base is that thin, that the single largest ethnic group that's coming of age in our school system, we've got next to no research on? How can we possibly be prepared to take an evidence-based position on how to meet the needs of those families? And so that means we need to start using our intellect and our reason as much as our science. The science is important, but we need to be able to think about the relevance of this science to the application that's at hand. And that application may be an ethnic group. It may be whether or not it's relevant to adopted children as opposed to foster children, as opposed to biological children. But each one of those groups has a specific identity and the ability to be able to raise a voice that says, no, these are the things that are important to me and my family. Because in the end, it's the families that matter. It's not the science, it's not the publications, it's not the grant dollars, it's none of those things. But rather, it's the families that matter. Because if we use science to bludgeon families by the way they should behave, or the way they should be interacting, well, then science is going to become an enemy rather than an asset. And finally, as we think about science and as we think about what can we do for impoverished families, as we think about how are we going to take on this new generation of students that are coming into the American classroom from an impoverished background, I would submit to you that it's incredibly important to be compassionate. The knee-jerk reaction for many of us, and myself included, I am not alone. I mean, I am not preaching something other than some thoughts, and that is, we take a look at a family and we go, "Where'd you mess up?" A kid is acting out in the classroom, and the very first thing that we think of is, "Man, this kid is definitely he got up this morning, he wanted to make my life miserable as a teacher," or as a parent, "Man, that child, he just doesn't want to stick with it." Or we take a look at some child that's misbehaving in the restaurant, and we go, "Man, those parents should be doing something about that." What kind of a parent would let their child do that? But it's oftentimes without information. And so as you think through over the course of the last 18 minutes, science is important. But until we have a better job of being able to reproduce it, it can't be the end all. It is not a God. In the meantime, science needs to move on, but we need an alternative way of approaching the very problems that are at issue here. And I suggest to you that asking families, involving them in the very research questions that we're asking is fundamental to being able to improve the replicability and the reproducibility of science. And then lastly, I submit to you that we need to have some compassion. Those families are living and they need help. Thank you.